Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss a second assassination attempt on Donald Trump, exploding pagers in Lebanon, and the Teamsters union deciding not to make an endorsement in the presidential race. I'm joined by Sohrab Ahmari and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So we learned this week that once again, an attempt on Trump's life was made. He was not this time grazed by a bullet, but we saw a lot of reactions. A lot of blame went around. Some directed at Trump, some directed at his critics. Geoff, what did you make of it?
So a few things. I mean, in this case, we have a contrasting instance with the attempted assassin in Pennsylvania, who was a sort of standard mass shooter profile type figure, a kind of alienated young man of some sorts who whose ideological orientation was unclear, who hadn't really left that much of a footprint online, perhaps unusually for someone of his age. And so he ends up being something of an enigma. In this case, we have a figure with quite a vast kind of online footprint, who has made himself a very public figure. So the first precedent I thought of here was Lee Harvey Oswald, who I'm often struck when I tell people that who haven't read like Don DeLillo's Libra or seen Oliver or remember Oliver Stone's JFK. I mean, what's remarkable about Lee Harvey Oswald was he was quite a public figure because of his high-profile defection to the USSR, followed by his return to the US, and so he had really made himself an object of attention prior to, and sought to make himself an object of attention, prior to the assassination, which I guess works somewhat against our expectation that assassins are these kind of obscure weirdos who just emerge out of the shadows to carry out the spectacular act. And so this guy as well had really tried to kind of insert himself into the discourse on various things, most notably Ukraine. He's kind of a fanatical pro-Ukraine figure who had volunteered or attempted to volunteer there, who had also written seemingly a strange self-published book. And so, in this case, we have a pretty clear sort of profile for him. So unlike Thomas Matthew Crooks, who attempted to assassinate Trump in Pennsylvania, Ryan Routh was a figure who, we have to assume had been at least somewhat on the radar of various security and intelligence services because of his activities in Ukraine. So, of course, that's going to raise a lot of eyebrows and lead those conspiratorially minded to draw their own conclusions. On the other hand, he clearly came across as a unhinged and sort of unreliable figure. He had been a sort of ideologically somewhat amorphous sort of voter and partisan. He had supported Tulsi Gabbard at some point. He had said he had voted for Trump in 2016. He, has donated to some Democrats, although I think most of those donations actually went to Gabbard. Somewhat surprisingly, given Gabbard is generally thought of as a kind of pro-Russian figure. So, he was clearly an erratic and somewhat confused character. So, just basic smell test, it's kind of hard to believe that any intelligence services would entrust a major task to someone of his profile. But the other thing that kind of struck me was the parallel with another attempted assassination compact covered earlier this year, which was that of Robert Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, where again there you had an assassin who was an older guy. I think in this case, Routh was somewhere around 59 or 60. The assassin or would-be assassin in Slovakia was, I think, about 70. But interestingly, both were these kind of fervent NATO partisans and sort of pro-Ukraine partisans. And so, there's something interesting here about like the extreme center, perhaps we might say, that we tend to think of like political violence as coming from the fringes. And what's peculiar in these two cases is that you have someone who seems to be ideologically aligned with sort of Brussels and the DC policy sort of foreign policy apparatus, attempting to carry out an assassination, which again isn't what how we've been led to imagine political violence would occur, right? That it would come either from the far left or far right. Fringes here, we have figures who are ideologically aligned with the center, but who are nevertheless carrying out these seemingly lone wolf attacks of the sort we tend to associate with the extremes of impermissible sort of political opinion. And so what's striking there is I would say in part just it's symptomatic of the weirdness of politics today, that sort of anybody and anything can be a kind of path to radicalization, to extremism of some sort or another. And that the center itself weirdly can kind of attract these oddballs and eccentrics who will attempt to bring about all too literally things that it seems to want. So I guess I would I would sort of read this figure almost psychoanalytically as a kind of symptom of the derangement of the center, of the derangement of the establishment. He's a kind of return of the repressed, or some kind of it's not that there's a sort of direct causal relation where he's like doing their bidding, but rather that he's a kind of repressed underside of the unhinging and derangement of the center of the establishment. That in many regards, as I think various things we've published have substantiated, is no less extreme than what it derides as the fringes.
Yeah, I was struck by the same thing. That was my uh, take as well in a column I wrote for the New Statesman, that this guy had the ideology of the Atlantic Council of Bill Kristol and Tory Newland. He's in a way separating the fact that he had a long criminal record, mostly like petty crimes. Uh, Driving, under the influence, that sort of stuff. But setting all that aside, he would have been a golden boy in a way for Atlanticist ideology. Going out of his way not only to recruit volunteers from the United States, but he actually was working supposedly, or allegedly, I should say, to recruit fighters for the Kiev government from Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. Um, and it again, I think it goes to show. I very much agree with Geoff that to use the phrase from Pierre Manon, he had a great essay around 2016-17 when the transatlantic populist ferment was just taking hold, that there is an extremism of the center. That what is often called the center is actually a kind of set of political commitments that lots of ordinary people who are in the middle of politics, in the middle road of politics, don't have a voice in objecting to, but they definitely reject, like escalating relentlessly against Russia over Ukraine is very much an establishment cause. Even if lots of Americans and your ordinary Americans, Europeans might have sympathy for Ukraine, they don't want nuclear war. They don't want a direct confrontation with Russia. But our establishment center wants that, and that's what Manon refers to when he talks about the extremism of the center. But in this case, the extremism of the center, took on a literal connotation, because he apparently took it upon himself to take on a politician, Trump, whom he once admired. He tweeted in 2020 that I voted for you in 2016, but now here you are disappointing all of us. Apparently, I mean, the connection is not quite clear yet, but apparently over Ukraine, which had become his central cause in life, his defining cause in life. And so I think that's a warning to lots of people in the establishment who rightly deride extremist rhetoric, especially on social media, that comes from the far left and far right, that these days extremists can draw from unexpected ideological wellsprings. So the responsibility to tamp down extremist rhetoric that might set people off in a country where there are more guns than people is not just on, Trump or the far left. It's also on the center, which is unfortunately has been very comfortable, I would say, with extremist rhetoric of its own. I don't think, for example, criticizing Trump for the events of January 6th necessarily triggers people to try to kill him. However, comparing him to Hitler or saying that he's worse than Hitler, which is something that, for example, some establishment Democratic figure like Claire McCaskill did, or the editors of the New Republic a couple of weeks before the Pennsylvania assassination attempt, as Matthew Schmitz and I pointed out in a column for Compact, put sort of transposed Trump's image on a very famous National Socialist election poster for Hitler. They sort of took his face and imposed it on that older, kind of infamous, iconic image of Hitler, using the kind of Nazi font, etc. That stuff could trigger some people. It might be a different type of person than a far right or far left activist who gets fired up about that, but it tells you that, as Geoff has said, and I guess I've tried to make clear, there is a real extremism of the center as well.
And there's a bit of a problem there because the people who engage in this rhetoric, calling Trump Hitler or worse than Hitler, will then issue statements saying that they are so glad that he wasn't harmed in the latest attack. And if they really believed what they said, I don't see why they would shed many tears over Trump being shot. So, uh, you know, they either need to have you know, they either need to admit that they really do believe this and not pretend not to when it occurs, or else they need to only say what they really believe, I think. Sorry to wag my finger, but please come on. Just weigh your words. Uh, this incredible story in Lebanon, uh, thousands of pagers exploding all at once after getting a message at 3:30 p.m. A couple things struck me about it right away. One, maybe your supply chains matter. Maybe the people who are making your electronic devices should have your own security at heart. Whoever you are. So, say you're the world's, say you're the United States, and all of your cell phones are made in China. That could potentially pose a national security threat to you. So you might want to pay some attention to who's making your phones. Not every country is going to be able to have control over its supply chain, but if you have a certain amount of economic wherewithal, maybe you want to attend to that. Uh, the other thing that struck me about this story was the many voices uh, on what I would describe as the third worldist left, and then the kind of third worldist right, which has emerged more recently, describing this attack as a war crime or uh, an instance of terrorism. It's hard to imagine something more precisely targeted. Uh, there is collateral damage, which is always terrible, but on the other hand, to really go at several thousand people at once and to have a very precisely targeted small charge directed at each one of these people who's a member of an enemy organization. Uh, if precision is an element of just war, it's hard to imagine something more precise.
Yeah, I echo that point, Matthew. So just to pan out to the geopolitics of this, the tragedy here is that Lebanon is a state and a nation that's held hostage by a terror group, Hezbollah. And it's that terror group, it's Hezbollah, that's decided to unleash numerous missiles at Israel since the events of October 7. And unfortunately, that puts the people of Lebanon, many of whom they just want to go about their lives, that puts them at risk, because then Israel will respond. And as far as Israeli responses go, fairly targeted use of explosives to blow up pagers and similar devices, as Matthew pointed out, is far more precise and less likely to cause mass casualty damage than the enormous amounts of ordnance, Hiroshima level ordnance that the IDF has dropped on Gaza. So the kind of third world is whinging about this. I can't find myself in sympathy with, because it is Hezbollah. Hezbollah has no reason to pick a fight with this much stronger adversary that can kick Lebanon against the wall. And if the kicking is going to happen, as Matthew said, and I'll stop here because I think we both made the point, going after their pagers in this kind of fairly precise way is more humane in a wartime context than massive bombing.
I'll just say briefly, it's clearly on one level, the significance of this was symbolic. I mean, the October 7th was itself a massive and humiliating defeat for the much vaunted Israeli intelligence services, which were seen as sort of the best in the world, and yet were unable to stop this quite brazen attack. And so, this was in a way a way of regaining their footing symbolically, as well as dealing a blow, in practical and organizational terms to their most potent enemy in the region, at least in their immediate vicinity, and the most significant proxy of the Iranian sort of axis of resistance, as it's called. And so it was clearly a kind of way of trying to reestablish their reputation, in a sense, and it was a remarkable. It's fascinating to read the accounts of how exactly this went about. I mean, it involved creating this shell company, this Taiwanese electronics manufacturer with a headquarters in Hungary. So extremely advanced levels of kind of international intrigue. It will probably, I can imagine it being made into, or at least figuring in a movie someday. Quite a fascinating story. But the other thing that seems kind of notable here is that after October 7th, when Israel was dealt this major blow, there was a great deal of kind of, really from the kind of, as Matthew said, sort of left and right wing third worldist factions, this kind of celebration of the rising power of Iran and its allies as this kind of great this rising force of multipolarity. And yet, again and again, it seems that Iran and its proxies have been, the exception here, I think, would be the Houthis in Yemen, who have achieved something quite disturbing and remarkable in their ability to blockade the Red Sea. But, other than that, it's really just been one kind of humiliating blow after another to Iran's ability to project power in the region. Whether the brazen assassination of a top Hamas official in Tehran, or this most recent attack, and then the crash of the helicopter with the Iranian president, which by all accounts was not actually a Mossad operation, although I suppose that hasn't been ruled out. But and it's sort of an interesting question, like would it look worse for Iran to have fallen victim to a brazen attack that successfully assassinated its own president, or would it look worse to just admit that they have like shitty old helicopters that like don't work that well? Either way, it doesn't look good. And so, it does seem like there's after the spectacular success of October 7th and the seeming success of the Houthi blockade, beyond that, it's really been a kind of series of humiliating blows to Iran and its allies in the region. This one being the most spectacular yet, perhaps, in its elaborateness and sophistication. And so it does, at least paint the region as in more of a deadlock than it was previously. Where, yes, Israel looks certainly weaker than it did at previous points in its history, but its main challenger has really been unable to sustain any strong image of itself as a kind of indefatigable rising power. And so, what you end up with perhaps is, ironically, the plan that Obama's administration conceived for the Middle East, which would allow a sort of drawing down of American resources in the region, was some sort of stalemate or some sort of balance of powers between the major contenders in the region, where they would essentially cancel each other out, and this would allow the United States to put its attention elsewhere. So far, that dream has clearly not been achieved. We keep getting dragged in various ways, but nonetheless, it's I suppose kind of interesting, because perhaps the grim reality is that what a sort of balance of power looks like in this region is something like a series of humiliating defeats to both sides, which persuades both of them to stand down and give up on their more delusional ambitions for sort of a total territorial expansion and regional dominance. So I think the situation remains pretty disheartening, and I all I can say is, I suppose the best we can hope for is the establishment of some sort of deterrence that will eventually allow for a dialing down of the conflict. But in the meantime, we may see more kind of spectacular operations of this sort going forward.
Now, excuse me. Sorry, Stephen. I'm just kind of getting over a cold here. Now, I do want to get to this. The U.S. election, some interesting news. The Teamsters Union declined to endorse any candidate. Sohrab, why was this notable?
Well, it was notable in several respects. First is and foremost is the fact that they also released their internal polling, both a town hall, an in-person town hall that was conducted before President Biden bowed out of the 2024 race, and then two polls afterward when Vice President Harris was selected as the Democratic nominee. Those were one by phone and the other online polling, and so lots to dig into there. But the in-person town hall results showed a plurality for Biden, and then I think about 45% or 40%, something like that, and then maybe about 35% for Trump. The post Biden dropout phone and internet polls, however, showed Trump really thumping Kamala Harris among the membership of the Teamsters. 65% to 35%, 60% to 40%. Those were the types of figures that we're talking about with the Teamsters. So, given that, you could see this as a kind of humiliation for Kamala Harris, because obviously she is associated with what's considered the most pro-union administration in American history, or certainly since the New Deal. I think that's apparently actually a fairly, it's a fair description of the Bidenites, insofar as being pro-union is all about having a National Labor Relations Board that is pro-union. And in that case, I've praised them, and I think they deserve the praise. Now, there are other issues, and I'll get into those, having to do, for example, with trade or with green diktats, where those two commitments or these different sets of democratic commitments are at odds with each other. And I think that's what's driving some of the alienation of the Teamsters from the Democratic mainstream. So in that sense, it is a loss for Harris. But the fact that the union declined to endorse Trump, notwithstanding the fact that clearly a majority of the rank and file are with Trump, is in part a loss for Donald Trump, I have to say. I think, people will say that this is because the Teamsters would have been, destroyed by the Democrat if they formally endorsed Trump. I think there is something to that. I think the elected Democrats would definitely punish Sean O'Brien, the Teamsters president, if he did that. But their power is ultimately is not absolute, and given where the membership is, Sean O'Brien could have resisted to some extent that kind of pressure. So at least part of the blame has to lie with Trump himself in what he did in the aftermath of a very pro-worker Republican National Convention that featured, of course, Sean O'Brien giving a very pro-worker, pro-organized labor talk to an audience of Republicans who are not used to hearing that kind of rhetoric or hearing that kind of worldview. But in the aftermath, I think most notably, there was several missteps, but most notably was the conversation between Elon Musk and Donald Trump, in which Trump said, "Now, if you have striking workers, I know you like to fire them, and I like that. I'm only slightly paraphrasing, like, you get rid of them and you tell them you don't belong here anymore," and was sort of backslapping him for that. That was a painful moment for Sean O'Brien, because he had made this kind of gamble of trying to build bridges with the Republican Party, and he was forced subsequently to say that what I heard Sean O'Brien said of that conversation, what I heard was that's tantamount to, quote, economic terrorism. What Elon and Trump were chuckling about is economic terrorism. So I think that the endorsement could have come had there not been that moment. And it's kind of unfortunate for Trump that he wasn't able to clinch that. But last thing I'll say about this is, over the past, we're now how far from the debate? We're about a week and a half since the debate, as we're recording this. Kamala Harris continues to have fairly good national polling numbers coming out for her. Depending on the poll, some are likely voters, which is the most valuable, and some are registered voters, which is considered less valuable as polls. But at any rate, the numbers are coming in nationally +4, +3, +4, +5 for Kamala, and that's bringing her, poll of polls average to about a 2-point advantage for her, according to the latest Real Clear poll of polls. But these figures, these Teamster figures, are the kinds of things where you see that and you think that maybe the Harris team will be freaking out internally, because it just shows you how, what the national polls say might be different from what's happening among key voting blocks in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, that are representative of important voting blocks. So I think, although it was not a clear win for Trump either, because he didn't manage to get the endorsement, I think the overall balance of who took the bigger L out of this is unquestionably Harris.
So with that, thank you, Sohrab and Geoff, and thank you, listeners. For more, go to compactmag.com/subscribe.